Hi, everybody, and welcome. My name is Ruth Quint, and I'm a co-president at the League of Women Voters of Greater Pittsburgh. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization dedicated to empowering voters and defending democracy. Our nonpartisan nature is more important than ever in the current moment, and we are a trusted partner for advocacy groups that are currently working to defend democracy. Like the World Affairs Council, the League has been active in Pittsburgh for roughly a century, and like the World Affairs Council, we have always had an interest in international issues. For decades, we have had an observer at the United Nations, probably thanks to our early association with Eleanor Roosevelt in the League. However, our most important priority currently is working to protect our democratic systems from attack from within. We work to protect and expand voting rights and register new voters in many local venues, including high schools, naturalization ceremonies, community centers, and the county jail. We also engage in advocacy on a variety of issues, often through litigation at the local, state, and national levels. Our local league is powered by volunteers who care deeply about civic engagement and community dialogue. We believe democracy works best when people are informed, involved, and willing to listen to one another, values that are especially important at a time when public conversation can feel increasingly divided. That's why we're so pleased to be here tonight as the World Affairs Council kicks off their Civic Futures program series, and so pleased to see the community out in support of this important issue. We look forward to working with you all to defend democracy in Allegheny County and beyond. And now I'll introduce Hallie from Public Source.
Democracy doesn't fail all at once. It tends to thin out quietly at the edges when people lose the ability to see what's happening in their own communities. And that's why local journalism matters, not as a nice to have, but as an infrastructure for democratic life. I'm Hallie Stockton. I'm the editor-in-chief and executive director at Pittsburgh's Public Source. We're an independent, nonprofit newsroom focusing our reporting here on the Pittsburgh region. We're paywall-free and supported by readers and donors who believe Pittsburgh deserves trustworthy, rigorous local journalism. We cover what's happening here in government, in schools, the environment, and in health, and in neighborhoods that often go unnoticed. We ask hard questions of powerful institutions. We follow public money. We show up consistently for communities who often aren't served by the news. Local journalism serves as the foundation. It's where people can first form a civic life and get curious. Who represents me? Who is making the decisions? How is it getting done? Where is the money going? That understanding becomes the scaffolding for everything else, for engaging with state policies, national debates, and global forces. You can't build civic capacity from the top down alone. It starts close to home. We're glad to be in a room with people who care about all of it at every scale. If you want to get to know Pittsburgh's Public Source further, please stop by on your way out or visit publicsource.org. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Betty Cruz, the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Hallie and Ruth, for the work that you do every day at the League of Women Voters of Greater Pittsburgh and at Public Source. I'm delighted to be in partnership with you all as part of the team at the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh. I've been looking forward to this conversation with Jim and Gerardo to explore what democracy means in our changing world, and also to kick off our Civic Futures series as we celebrate 95 years of the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh this year. Very exciting. But also striking to me when you think about how different the world looks today from when we were founded, and yet how much stays the same. How so many challenges and fears that the US and the world faced in 1931 are still alive today. In part, that's why we called this series Civic Futures, because democracy is not a finished project. It's not self-sustaining, it's not inevitable. It is something that we must continuously shape, defend. Otherwise, we can see how it can be neglected. And we need to make our efforts to strengthen it and to redefine through institutions, through culture, through participation, and through power. So tonight is not about telling you what to think politically. It is about helping us to better understand what is happening in our world, internationally, nationally, locally, at this moment that we're living through, and understanding what role each of us still has in shaping what comes next. And with that, I'm honored to be here with Jim Sciutto, CNN anchor and Chief National Security Analyst. Let's welcome Jim. And Gerardo Berthin, President of Freedom House. Now let's begin. So I want to start by level setting. When each of you uses the word democracy, what are you actually describing?
I'm going to defer to you. It's your business.
Well, thank you, Betty, and it's really a pleasure to be here with you in Pennsylvania, in Pittsburgh, in this beautiful hall with the Gettysburg Address behind me. I think, from an individual perspective, for me, when the word democracy arises, is not a simple concept. It involves a number of processes and ideals, and I think, as Betty was referring, it is one of these systems and processes that has shown the ability to self-correct itself. It's one of the only systems, basically, that can do that, and I'm comparing it to non-democratic systems in which somebody else makes that decision for you. Also, just being part of an international global platform and seeing what's happening around the world and having worked in over 50 countries outside the US, I think there's no prescriptive definition of democracy, I would say, but it has to have some common elements that are rooted in the culture and the context. And some of them have to do with issues regarding accountability, for example, issues related to participation, the ability to participate in decisions, as well as something, a concept that we were talking off the stage, checks and balances. Somebody has to check and balance the different powers of the system. And so, and as you can imagine, that is not a very simple process to manage, more so in an age of technology, more so in an age of click and result, more so in an age of being connected in more than one way with each other. In the old days, obviously, it was much more simpler, but now that context, that ecosystem is actually much more complex, layered with a number of institution actors and challenges, but also opportunities, I would say. Yeah.
If I only to add to your brilliant analysis, ecosystem is the word that sticks out to me because it's more than just the right to vote, because there are so many institutions that inform the voters, that check the powers of those who are elected, that create the opportunity for people to organize, right, and seek outcomes and to be informed, right. There are so many pillars in that system, and through my time, I've covered and traveled in and lived in a lot of countries that claim to be democracies, right? They use that term. I mean, even North Korea has it in its name, right? The People's Democratic Republic, when in reality they're not. I mean, they claim to have elections every year. Of course, they're not free and fair. And then you have degrees sort of going down and up across the spectrum. And each of those pillars matters to making it a truly free society, right? And I have seen those pillars challenged in many countries. I've seen them fall. I've seen them built up again. I've seen leaders deliberately try to take them down, right, to expand and lengthen their power. And we can say that in our country we're seeing similar attempts, right? And any sense, as I was reading the Gettysburg Address here, 175 some odd years ago, when the Union and our democracy was very much challenged, and it got through that challenge, any sense that we have as Americans that we've fought and won all those battles already, I think, of course, we've lost in recent years, because you know that just because you have a right doesn't mean you're going to have it forever, that it requires constant work and defense over time, because there's always going to be someone trying to take it away from you, right? So we, much like the environment, right, we have to help maintain that ecosystem to keep all the living bodies in there healthy and happy.
If I can add just to Jim's points, I think there's two things that are now a reality. First of all, elections certainly are no longer, as Jim was saying, a metric of democracy. Some of the most non-democratic regimes hold elections, actually, and they get 102 participation because it's obligatory. But the other thing that actually I just want to bring to the fora is that often when we think of democracy, we're only thinking about one of the sides of that particular concept, which is government. And we're not seeing really the other side, which is citizens or civil society or people. It's actually a coin with two sides. And any society that doesn't have both balance, almost like a yin and yang, actually, will have deficits in either side of this particular area. And that's why I, as a political scientist, like to talk more about democratic governance rather than democracy, because to govern, anybody can govern. To govern democratically is really an art.
Why do you think it is that this particular word, democracy, the mere mention of it has become so politically charged? Is this unprecedented, or are there recognizable moments from history? I mean, we were talking earlier how even in the most divided political homes, democracy was, the aspiration towards it was a unifying word or concept or principle, and it seems that we're in a different place now.
Well, I think a couple thoughts, and I'd love to hear yours, Gerardo. One is that every word and concept is political in this country today, right? I mean, you can't say, I mean, things that we used to think were either bipartisan or nationally shared, everything is a battle. And sadly, I mean, I use this word tribal a lot. It's tribal. Like whatever is a gain from my side, or actually, more accurately put this way, whatever is a loss for the other side is a gain for me, right? We see that so often. So that, and democracy ends up, because if democracy empowers me and my side, then our country is living up to that value, right? If it benefits the other side, then it's not. By the way, some of our leaders speak in these terms, right? They claim the other side is trying to take things away from you, right? And if I'm not the person you choose, the country, we're saving America, right, by doing this. And it's not the first time this has happened in our country, but it is. It's certainly more pointed today than in arguably in generations where you have such that sense of division that we can't even agree on what's democratic. I mean, we're seeing that in the redistricting fight right now. And again, I think you see that same dynamic whereby all's fair for my side and nothing's fair for the other side, which is such a shame because, we do, in theory, have shared democratic values.
What do you think, Gerardo?
Yeah, and I will answer also by just, for those of you who are not familiar, Freedom House is an organization that was founded in 1941 by Eleanor Roosevelt and the guy who had actually run against her husband, Wendell Willkie. And they both, from opposite ideologies, from opposite experiences, came together because they were concerned about what was happening in the world in 1941. It's a classic case of bipartisanship, and I just want to mention that. Since 1973, Freedom House has been tracking one dimension of democracy, which is based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, rights and liberties. And definitely what we're seeing, we have tracked 20 consecutive years of decline of these liberties and rights. And one driver of that decline is precisely the polarization that you were talking about. But the polarization is more than anything a symptom of something else. And it has to do more than anything with the dysfunctionality of institutions, the lack of checks and balances, nowadays basically the lack of independent media in a sense. And so it responds to a number of areas in a way that bipartisanship actually that was so classic for the US for many years now has become a pain point because of this polarization and I would say dysfunctionality of basic institutions, I would say.
Can I add just one thought on that? I spent, in the 2000s, I spent a great deal of my reporting time in the Middle East. I was based in London, but I was covering Iraq and Afghanistan repeatedly, multiple assignments in the midst of those wars. Also spent a lot of time in Iran, a lot of time in Israel, Palestine. And during that time period, I was introduced to the Middle East conspiracy theory, right? It was my experience there that there was a conspiracy theory about everything. If something happened, it was almost always either a CIA plot or a Mossad plot or something. I covered an earthquake in Iran in 2004. You may remember it, the bomb earthquake. It killed many thousands of people. But there was a rumor running around Iran at the time that it was the result of a CIA superweapon, right? I mean, this is the extent of it. Now, what struck me, and many of my friends and commentators there, as I asked them, it's like, why is there a conspiracy theory about everything? And what you see is that when there's a loss of belief in institutions, when you think the government, and by the way, you're not making it up, right? When you think the government's lying to you or taking from you or is not functioning or is functioning in a corrupt way, you begin to not trust anything, right? You're like, they must be trying to screw me or this must be a plot. And what I tell folks now is like, I'm a citizen of the capital of the conspiracy theory today, right? We think this is America today. And why is that? It's partly because let's be frank, some of our leaders deliberately seed conspiracy theories to undermine the truth and truthful reporting about their activities, but I think it's also people are ripe for it because so many of us have lost confidence in institutions, more likely to listen to an influencer, right, who's telling them the great plot behind X as opposed to, listen to the facts. And that's just one of those experiences that shows, I think, and you know this better than me because you measure the health of democracy as one current challenge to our democracy.
Yeah, thank you for that. And on that point of the work that you've been doing, Gerardo, measuring the health of democracies. So if we can go a little deeper, you've been around 85 years now, Freedom House, tracking freedom and democratic conditions through your Freedom in the World report. And now you have this new report that you've just launched on transnational repression. What are some of the highlights that you think are especially relevant in the context of tonight's conversation to share with our audience?
Yes, our Freedom in the World report tracks 208 countries and territories around the world, so it's a good comparative data set of point. There are 25 indicators actually to measure what's happening in the world in these areas. Certainly this year in particular we see that there is, the drivers have to do mostly with coups in Africa, for example. They're back. We thought they were gone actually, but they're back. Also the fact that there's a lot of peaceful protests actually being quelled, being responded with, repression. And something that I think was mentioned in the introduction is there's a lot of democratically elected leaders who are actually trying to weaken constitutional safeguards. That is the headline of our Freedom in the World report of this year, which is available on our website. The other report that we just launched is on a concept that is much more complex, and certainly Jim will know because his book about China in particular and that region is very important. Transnational repression. In a simple words, it means that states, particularly authoritarian states, no longer respect political borders in order to inflict repression on their citizens. The classic case that initiated this was of a reporter, which I'm sure you know him, Khashoggi from the Washington Post, who had dual citizenship. He was from Saudi Arabia and he was the US, and he went to renew his Saudi Arabian passport in Turkey, and he never came back because he had written a lot of damning analysis of what was happening in Saudi Arabia. And so that is the classic example. So transnational repression is a tactic in which authoritarian regimes collaborate very tactfully. China is the #1 perpetrator of transnational repression, particularly against their minorities, the Uyghurs, people from Tibet, for example. And others are not far from China. We're talking about Russia, we're talking about Turkey, we're talking about Iran. It is a tactic actually to continue to harass and repress their citizens across the borders. And even now, with the technology that we are experiencing, they use technology very well, as digital repression is also part of their toolbox, in a way that they can have spyware in your phones. If you're away, they have a way actually to understand who you're talking to. And so it is well documented. From 2014 to 2025, we documented over 1,300 cases of transnational repression. And again, this is in our website that you can actually analyze each of the cases. China, Russia, Iran, and India are the countries that are actually much more performing this particular tactics of repression beyond your borders.
Jim, Gerardo made reference to your books. I want to go a little bit deeper with that. Thanks for walking us through that, Gerardo. The return of great powers, Russia, China, and the next world order. You speak to so many strategic shifts that have taken place, and I want to actually bring in a question that we received from the audience in advance of tonight's program. This audience member says, the world order of a decade ago is imploding. The US was the leader of that order. What mistakes or actions did the US take that have destabilized its global standing?
So just briefly on the book, I was inspired to write this book. I was in Ukraine in February 2022 when Russia launched its full-scale invasion. And it struck me as I was standing on the roof of a building there watching the first missiles flying over my head and hearing reports of the first tanks crossing the border, that this was a seminal historical moment, that while the world order had been tested in years prior by Russia, but also by China, partial invasion of Ukraine in 2014, partial invasion of Georgia 2008, and other places, that Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, an attempt to absorb the largest country in Europe, redraw borders by force, was a break with this brief intermission we had between the last Cold War and a new Cold War. I mean, a lot of us in this room remember 1989 and 1991 as moments of, it was all behind us, right? Liberal democracy had triumphed, but that full-scale invasion to me was a clean break with that period, and we were back in a new period of conflict among the great powers, and not just the US and the Soviet Union now, but the US against a combination of authoritarian states in Russia, China, and kind of as their junior partners, North Korea and Iran. And I believe, and on the back of the book it says, this struck me as a 1939 moment. I believe not only was it a break with that that brief period of peace, but also it was a test for us as Americans, for our country, and for liberal democracies around the world. Would we respond like we did in 1939 and 1941 and stand up, or would we give it a pass, right? And I think that's the answer to that question is still an open question, right? There was a period of time when the U.S. is supporting Ukraine quite robustly. That has largely ended. Europe is doing it, and Ukraine, frankly, is standing on their own 2 feet, which I think is another remarkable story. I think the answer to that test is still an open one. And the fact is, under this new administration, Trump is reorienting America's relationship with the world and with the world order and with democratic values, frankly. I mean, are they a goal of U.S. foreign policy anymore? It doesn't seem to be, right? He envisions cozy relationships with Putin and Xi. He is dismantling alliances that are as old as your organization, in fact, almost, or a little bit younger. When you think of NATO, he just doesn't see the value. And that is, that's another seminal moment in our country's history. Is that an intermission for this country? Will the next president try to reorient the U.S. back into a leadership position for these values and institutions? We don't know. Open question. To the audience members' question as to what the U.S. did, to kind of lead us to where we are today. I think where we are today, I think we are retreating from a role of defending that world order, which, while imperfect, did help keep the peace and did help project not just American power, but also values around the world. If you go back further, folks will often ask me, did the U.S. miss an opportunity to avoid conflict with Russia in Europe, but also with China? I would argue that Putin had a vision in mind going back 20 some odd years of recreating Russia's, if not the Soviet empire, at least a Russian sphere of influence, that I don't believe America could have satisfied that with more respect for Putin, etc. Putin looked at 1991 as a great tragedy, and he wanted to reverse that. He didn't look at it as, the USSR seeing the light. He wanted to gain back power. So I'm skeptical of the idea that there was some sort of accommodationalist path. Similarly with China, and I'll end it there because it's a long answer to a short question. As our president goes to China, China, as Trump visits, is very much convinced it has the upper hand over the US. And this is not new to the Trump administration, although they do believe that the Trump administration has accelerated America's decline. Even prior, the Chinese view is that the US is on this trajectory and China is on this trajectory. And that is not a new historical phenomenon. It is China regaining its position as a dominant world power. They see us as in decline, our institutions rotting, internal divisions, all this kind of stuff as to their advantage, and they see Trump's retreat from alliances, et cetera, as accelerating that path. So just, in the current news in a great power context, I know you were probably going to bring that up anyway, but I led you there. That is certainly their view. So from China's perspective, I don't believe that accommodation would have avoided it because they had this plan and this aspiration in mind.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. You beat me to it. It's an interesting time with the president's trip to Beijing and the state visit that's happening. Let's pull back, though. You've mentioned 1939. We've talked about Freedom House being around for 85 years. When you look at what we're seeing globally, what feels new when you look at 20 years back or even in the last 10 years?
Do you want to start?
Yes. A lot, I would say. There is certainly expectations that are higher because simply of the communication and technology that we have now. Everybody lives really in real time, whether you have different time, time zones. We were talking earlier that as a political scientist, there is something called political communities, which are these almost natural electoral districts, which have a velocity of change that is higher than the capacity of institutions to adjust to these political communities. Not only are they younger, they're diverse. There's no longer this kind of cohesion in these political communities, and that's why there is incentives to continue to reform these institutions so people can feel represented and people can actually feel that the decisions that are being taken are actually decisions that they want. This is the Switzerland model, as I call it. When you go to Switzerland, which is a federation, the federal state plays no role in the daily lives of people. The county does. That's the local government in which basically taxes, schools, health, etc. And that's why that democracy is actually very strong in a sense, right? The other thing that is new to me is also the fact that you have this new ecosystem that Jim was talking about with different countries playing different type of foreign politics. And particularly authoritarian regimes, they have learned the art of collaborating, I would say, and democracies have not. The authoritarian regimes help each other. If someone goes to see Putin actually and they have a problem, it's almost like a car garage, they say. What's your problem? Okay, you need an engine, here's your new engine. Same thing with the Chinese. Democracies, on the other hand, actually are much more reluctant to help when democracies are in trouble. And last but not least, I would say the institutions that were created, multilateral institutions that were created in the 1940s, are no longer basically responding also to those demands. I'm specifically talking about, of course, the United Nations, which is about to elect another Secretary General. But the institution basically has grown much more incohesive, and countries like China, Russia, and others now have more influence than actually democracies in these bodies. So I would say that's new, and therefore maybe that is the new world order that Jim might be, I haven't read his book, but he might be referring to that. But there's a lot of new things in which the entire ecosystem probably has not adapted yet, I would say.
Gosh, there's a lot new. You know, being in the news business, every day my head is spinning, and maybe yours is as well. All you got to do is open the newspaper, turn on cable television, or look at your social media feed. In terms of the big new stuff, I mean, one of them is America's massively transformed role in the world, right? And again, that could be a short-term thing, but right now, the U.S. is reorienting itself with allies and adversaries and walking away from what were bipartisan alliances, principles, laws, etc. And it's jarring. I'm actually writing another book now because I've been spending much of the last year traveling among America's allies in Europe, Asia, to ask them their reactions to Trump's America First foreign policy. And what I heard only in private initially, which was, we don't trust America anymore, you now hear very much in public. I mean, you hear it in the public statements of the Mark Carneys and the Friedrich Merzes, et cetera, and you now have our allies reorienting themselves to defend themselves. Now, you can argue they should have had a bigger role in it, but there's more to that, in that both in terms of national security and trade, they don't look at the U.S. as a reliable, trustworthy, or a stable partner. That's a major change. And just like in our personal lives, reputations are difficult to build and easy to lose. And it's not something that can be flipped on its head after the midterm elections or a new president, because it's going to take time to win back those relationships, and it's an open question as to whether we do. In terms of other new stuff, I'll just say this. From a technological perspective, I write a lot about this in the book, that we have so many fronts in great power competition today that didn't exist in the last Cold War. Cyber warfare did not exist in the last Cold War. It is an active, hot front today. Thousands of cyber attacks, state actors, non-state actors, every day. In the previous Cold War, there was some talk and toying with the idea of weaponizing space. Today there are weapons in space. Both China and Russia have deployed laser weapons, kamikaze satellites, kidnapper satellites, because in the event of a war, that would be a front. They would attempt to steal satellite assets from the US or disable them, because that would blind us down here on Earth. AI is an entirely new front, right, both in our personal lives, but in relationships among the great powers, and drone warfare as well. You know, we're experiencing a time of the automation of war, and that has enormous effects in so many ways. And if you look at the Ukraine war, 80% of the casualties now are the results of drones. US, China, everybody's reorienting their defense around that, and that's going to, and we saw that in the Iran war too, right? It's a leveler, because it allows smaller actors to take down bigger actors in asymmetric form. That's just some of the long list of new stuff I think we're experiencing right now.
Excellent, thank you for that. And for anybody who hasn't read Jim's book yet, The Return of Great Powers, it is available thanks to Stay Gold Books for sale after the talk here.
Betty gets a cut of, you know, every sale. So if you want to help her out, you know, I'm not going to pressure you.
And you'll be signing copies too, which will be great. I want to bring us closer to the national landscape. So in the US, we're seeing fierce debates taking new heights on everything from voting rights, the Voting Rights Act, immigration, the boundaries of executive power, and the implications these policies have on people. Are these signs of democratic decline? Are they an example of democratic stress, or is it democracy's functioning as intended?
Well, let me begin by saying certainly our latest report on freedom in the world declined the U.S. score by 3 points. The U.S., it's an index that measures 0 to 100, the level of freedoms. The U.S. is still a free country in our index, but now it sits at 82 points over 100. And the 3 reasons that we actually decline had to do with, first, this dysfunctionality and polarization that we were talking about. Second, a lot of flexibility on anti-corruption measures, particularly in areas related to conflict of interest, beginning from the top all the way to the bottom. And last but not least is this type of protective right that actually we were talking about, freedom of expression, in particularly of non-US communities, if I can use that name, in which, you know, now the state has the right to search your social media to understand what type of posts have you put. If not, they will actually not allow you to be in the country. That is a trend, by the way, not only in the US, but in other democracies, and it should be concerning. Certainly, there are other studies that I encourage you to read, because Freedom House has a very particular way of analyzing democracy. But there's 2 more that I will recommend you read that are not Freedom House publications. The first one is called Varieties of Democracy. It is an annual study that is published out of Netherlands. Now, that study claims that the United States democracy, it demoted its democracy from a liberal democracy to an electoral democracy, and it claims that the US's democratic governance has declined to the levels of the 1960s. That is, democracy is a priority. The other one is the Economist Intelligence Unit Democracy Index, which was also published 2-3 weeks ago. They also don't call the United States a democratic country anymore. They call it a hybrid regime that has actually elements of both non-democratic and democratic. So all of that to say, these indicators, which are photographs of different incidents that are happening in these countries, are beginning to show that there is certainly a decline, but also there's a lot of recommendations actually that can actually help that decline. Not overnight, but certainly beginning to renew and reset basically those aspirational and institutional elements that made the United States one of the greatest countries ever in the world, right? So, and it was a beacon of hope for many communities outside the US. I think still is, but certainly we want to continue to cheer for that beacon of hope here, for the people, by the people, and of the people, yeah.
Another just experience from covering the Mideast in the 2000s, an example, I think, of American hubris. We can be, as a country, capable of great things, but as you know, through history, we can also be a victim of our own hubris. At the time, a lot of American commentators would say about democratic elections in the Middle East that, oh, sure, but you'll only have one election because the guy will get elected and then he'll control everything so that he keeps power in perpetuity. And certainly there were a lot of examples, certainly not confined to the Middle East, of that. Here we are in a country where we have elected someone, and by the way, twice, but who has taken steps to try to rig elections in his favor. I mean, if you go back to January 6th, and it wasn't just the day of January 6th, but weeks of attempting to overturn an election, and now you have other steps made to restrict who can vote, to reduce democratic advantages, a whole host of things. Rare instances of, or I think unprecedented instances of mid-decade redistricting, are all part of an attempt to keep power outside of the election. Doesn't mean the election won't happen. It's just that, in our own country, we're seeing an effort by an elected leader to try to, rig the system. And that's, I think it's one of many examples where as a country we imagine that we'd put all this behind us, but we've had a lesson in recent years that those battles, our own attempts as members of this democracy to protect our own rights, it's never over, right? We have to keep this system healthy ourselves by defending and working to stay informed and vote and organize, et cetera. That's one thought. The other thought I would just say on corruption, I spent a lot of time in Russia. I lived in China, spent a lot of time covering Russia, a lot of time in the Middle East, and I saw quite open corruption in governments there that I used to think was confined. I mean, America's always had corruption, but the degree of open political corruption today is pretty remarkable. I'll just give you an example. I served in government. I was chief of staff to the U.S. ambassador to China for a couple years, a little over 10 years ago. And general State Department rules, and any of you who've worked in government know this, is you can't own individual stocks, right, in your 401k, just mutual funds, because if I say own General Motors and General Motors comes to do some business in the U.S. Embassy, no one would want to accuse me of, trying to do a favor because I own $5,000 of General Motors stock. Today we have a president and his family taking open public positions, right, in companies. Planes, his son's getting Pentagon contracts for a drone company, et cetera, which, the vast majority of people in government can't come even close to, and is happening right before our eyes. The final example I'll give you, just because I was having dinner the other night with some friends for Mother's Day, and one of our good friends who was there, he's a lawyer, and our kids does anybody have kids with Greenlight accounts? Greenlight, it's basically a debit card, but you could also invest in stocks, like your kid could buy $5 at Google, whatever. It's a great way for them to learn finance. And he was saying how his daughter had to sell all her stocks in Greenlight, which probably amounted to $25, right? Because he was a partner in a DC law firm, and if they ever had business with Google, that could be considered a violation or a conflict of interest. And I was just thinking, that $25 of Greenlight stock compared to what we're seeing, and again, this is a measure of the health of democracy. Do those standards apply to everyone, or just to certain people? Do people in power get to exempt themselves from those standards? I mean, these are all part of that ecosystem, I think.
This reminds me of another question that we received from the audience. It says, given the widely held belief that big campaign donors unfairly influence politics, could a voter dollar system to publicly finance campaigns by giving voters money to donate, aka democracy vouchers or dollars, help strengthen American democracy?
Yeah, I mean,
probably have an index on this, right?
We don't, but I'm just going to talk of personal experience, because I did the study actually comparing how different countries finance their democratic campaigns, the political campaigns. And in this context, I think the US is an anomaly, because most countries actually have different combinations of systems. One that is very common to level the playing field is public finance for campaigns, meaning that every candidate gets basically not only the same amount of funding, but also the same media exposure. That's one. There are other countries that are a bit more eclectic, and they do have something like an individual account with a certain limit for citizens actually to go to a formal place and actually have a donation up to I don't know, $2,000, $5,000. And that's how they finance basically their democracy. And these are countries like Finland, who in our index has been #1 for almost 20 years. This is country like Norway, countries like Denmark. And so there are cases in which basically you can see how they finance. And even in our hemisphere, I would say Chile is one of the countries that has this combination of systems in a way, and they're able to have clean, transparent, kind of fair elections. And I would say that is something that actually makes the U.S. system a bit eclectic, actually.
Well, I remember it's a few cycles ago, presidential cycles, that was the first billion-dollar American presidential campaign. It might have been 2012, or I think Obama was involved, maybe it was 2016. Now $1 billion seems like chump change, right, in these elections. Since Citizens United, corporations are people, there are virtually no limits, just as a citizen, boy, wouldn't it be great if we had short elections like the UK, I don't know, 6 weeks, and not $1 billion. But this is a fact of life in America. I will say that money, in my experience, and I'm not a political analyst, but I've covered a lot of elections, does not always translate into victory, right? If you see the amount of money that Elon Musk spent on the judge's race in Wisconsin, right? And the voters got out and said, no, Elon Musk is not going to buy this judge, and it wasn't even close. Tom Steyer is running for, how many times has Tom Steyer run? He spent a lot of his own money. You need more than money to win an election. It definitely matters, but it doesn't necessarily dictate the results. And I think that's another example when folks ask me, well, what can they do what agency do we have to steer the country in a different direction? We all have agency. We inform ourselves as best we can and make a decision. And not, how many political ads have you watched in the evening and not learned a single thing from them, right? They almost sound like parodies of themselves. You have like the devil running against the devil. You're like, oh my God, I better not vote for either of these guys. But I don't think it always works, right, in practice.
So in a moment, we're going to turn it over to the audience for questions. Brian will be running mics, so keep an eye out, wave to him, and we would love to hear from you. But to close us out, can you share, in terms of lessons from around the world, you've spoken to a few already in terms of rankings. We've heard from folks around this idea of how cities can serve as democracy incubators. What comes to mind in terms of either other examples from around the world or actions that people can take so that it's not just about how we can help democracies survive pressure, but how do we rebuild public trust? What can local communities actually do?
Well, I'll start, and I'll go back to my example of Switzerland, because I think that is an example of a democracy that somebody was saying, I think when you introduce building democracy from the bottom up, not from the top down. In Switzerland, as I said, basically, the president of the country has basically very little power. However, the county council to the country has a lot of power to actually not only make decisions, but also be accountable for those decisions. I think also, just in my own experience as somebody who has worked in many countries, running a city actually is very different from running a country. And I think I take my hat out of mayors in particular, because mayors, even in our country, they can get booted off the office if they don't clean the snow fast enough. That was Washington, D.C., where you live, right? But also I think it's the place where actually there could be more accountability of government. There's a concept that is called social audit that a lot of counties here in the US, for example, apply, which is citizens doing a social audit of the governments to understand, for example, how they pay for school, whether a particular infrastructure project has been done according to specification, and that gives power to the community. This is, again, I go back to the coin of two sides in a way, right? At the national level, I think it's much more difficult to see that, But certainly as you go down the layers of government, you have more possibilities actually of rooting that democratic practice in both the government side but also the citizen side, because I cannot see them actually separated. I have to see them together. And certainly, if I have a wish in my next life, I would like to be a mayor of a mid-city and experience that challenge that you have actually of running city affairs, taxes, decisions, councils, referendums, and so forth. I think it'll be a very, very interesting job to have.
Pittsburgh looks great, by the way. Speaking of cities like running themselves well, you know, that stuff matters, and it's direct contact with the service provider and the customer, right? You know, do the buses, are they clean? Are they on time? Are the parks clean? Can my kids play in the park? You know, are the schools working? All that kind of stuff. I will say, just like bigger picture for a moment, is that this pendulum swing we're seeing politically in this country from sort of right-wing populism, you know, back to more mainstream on basically razor-thin margins. I mean, what presidential election hasn't been decided by 2% in the last like 25 years? It's not confined to the US, it's happening in Europe, right? I mean, you see these swings from right to left. The UK, you know, just had a landslide for the Labour Party 2 years ago, and, you know, just rewarded the Reform Party, which was the parent of Brexit, which has been an awful, you know, economic disaster. The pendulum might swing that way. If you look at, say, Hungary had 16 years of exactly this kind of leader we're talking about, elected but deliberately dissolving institutions to try to stay in power. He got beat, you know, so this is, you know, it's not confined to us. And by the way, it's not just on us, it's on our political leaders to come up with plans that work and serve people's interests, because one reason you have these swings is that both parties, or both the right and left in so many of these countries, including our own, have not been able to solve big problems, right, for a period of time. And at the same time, just while you're still thinking about today's and yesterday's problem, we have a huge one on our doorstep, which is the effect of AI, which is going to massively change, you know, job opportunities for you and me and for our kids. What plan have you heard from Washington, you know, to deal with that? That it's on us, but it's also on our leaders to come up with plans that work and allow themselves to be tested when they fail.
Hear, hear. Thank you for that. This is an excellent moment to pause and to thank you both. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Gerardo. If you can please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you very much.
Now we'd love to turn to you. Brian is up front, and just raise your hand and we'll take your question. Please.
Okay. Thank you very much. I would like you gentlemen to comment about how the moral values have declined now, not only with the leaders as well as among the general public, and how much influence that has had what we are going through at present in the democracy.
It's a very interesting question. I think in general, what I'm seeing actually as I look at different countries, again, and this was the US leadership, I would say, they set standards in basic things, particularly in public service. Integrity, ethics, even things like internal controls for organizations. All of these were created as a result of US businesses actually they're trying to be effective, efficient, and create employment. And the states actually, or the public institutions, trying to adopt that in a sense. I think that is a little bit lost, I think, in general. For example, transitions from one political party to another one were much smoother before. And it was because you had a cadre, good structure of civil servants, for example, right? Which by themselves, they needed to carry this ethos of being a public servant, right? They could have a choice to work in the business sector and make more money, but you have to be a public servant, you have to have a certain value in a sense, right? To actually serve, you know, that purpose. I think also there is, in many countries, this confusion, or I would say articulation, with very extremist religious values, I would say. And that tends to kind of maybe generate confusion in terms of what is moral and what is not, for example, right? In essence, I think for me, religion is a very private, element. But certainly, the function of the state, or the function of decisions, or the function of business is a much more kind of practical endeavor. But in generally speaking, I think our generation of young people right now, we're talking over lunch, it is one of these communities that probably is much more disenchanted with what's happening around the world. We have data, not Freedom House, but other organizations. They are voting less in general. They are trusting less. They are not becoming members of political parties in general, but that doesn't mean that they are not Democrats by nature, or they have moral values. It's just they are looking for something different. When you talk to some of these younger people, and when I talk age is 18 to 25 is kind of what the age that I'm looking and talking about, is that they see their representative, and the average world parliamentarian age is 42 years old. And they don't see themselves represented. Some of them, they want, for example, the laws to run for office, which in the US, if I'm not mistaken, is 25 for representatives, and is it 35 for senators, if I'm not mistaken? They want to lower that, because now younger people are smarter, they're more informed, they have better tools to make decisions. And some countries, Brazil, for example, is a country that now allows 16-year-olds to vote. And they vote in mass, by the way, both at the federal level and at the local level. And so that is another area, basically, where probably what you were thinking can articulate one of these renewed values of service, ethics, and integrity for public service. Yeah.
You know, it's something I think about. I have 3 kids, and I was 17, 15, and 10, and I worry, particularly if you talk to teenagers today, perhaps some of you have teenagers, worry about them becoming cynical, right? Because they see so much failure around them, and they're like, I can't, I'm not interested in politics. Politics is full of a bunch of crooks, right? And I try to balance that by, telling them that they do have agency, and there are a lot of ways to contribute and influence the process. Because if we lose them, then we're all, it's all over. But I will say this, I try in my job, because, there's a lot of bad news every day, I try to still allow myself to be surprised. And one thing that has struck me is that young people are taking paths that folks would never have seen. For instance, church attendance is up. For the first time in years among younger people. I sponsored a friend's daughter for her confirmation, and you go for one of the events at the main cathedral in DC, and there were hundreds of people in that church, young people, and from, every ethnic background imaginable, and it's in the numbers. Drinking is down among teenagers. It's interesting. They have longer relationships. Sometimes we imagine it's all going downhill, but young people are making choices for and maybe in part because they see bad examples up here. They're like, I'm going to live my life better, right? And more power to them. But there are some, I think, hopeful trends among young people. Maybe they're better than us.
I know I definitely find much hope in the young people that we get to work with. Another question in the back, and then another in the front. Pavel, and then across the way, Brian, and then over here.
Hi, Jim. Hi, Gerardo. My name is Pavel. I'm actually a former youth board member for the council, so it's a privilege to be with you guys tonight. I'm also studying political science, and one of the things I remember learning about was when they were drafting the Constitution, people were anxious about what type of government system we would have, and Ben Franklin famously walked out, and they asked him, well, what is it going to be? And they said, a democracy if we can keep it. So I guess my question for you two is, aside from voting and promoting people to vote, how do we keep our democracy in this state?
To answer that, or Yeah, that is the the $40 billion question nowadays, right? Again, when we're talking, for example, constitutions are not meant to be static documents, particularly if the political community is changing so fast. We noted that in the United States, the last time there was an amendment actually to the Constitution was, I think, a relevant amendment was in 1970s, and a less relevant amendment which had to do with the salaries of the Congress people was in 1990. But after that, there was no amendment, right? And so that is one area where basically probably there needs to be a little bit of innovation actually, because the country of the United States of 1970 is no longer the country of the United States of 2026. It's a very different country, yeah. I think also there are other tools that you can actually utilize. Again, engaging more the community, as Betty was saying, engaging more this issue of accountability, right? I think in political science there is the horizontal accountability, which is what tools do you have within the state for checks and balances, right? That's internal controls, IGs, for example, and all that. But also there is the vertical accountability, which speaks to the power of the people. It speaks actually of holding elected officials accountable. Elections used to be that social auditing tool. They're no longer, because as soon as somebody gets elected, has the incentive to start already running for his or her election, right? And so it's just about innovation, I would say, and it's the time in which we need more innovation, more new thinking about how to govern in an age of technology, of ecosystem evolution, and just different things that were not there in the past, I would say. Yeah.
This is one sadly awful trend line, right? Because our Congress was already deeply, deeply polarized, and that's partly structural, right? Because you only have a handful of competitive districts every cycle, maybe 24 or so. And with the current redistricting push, you're going to create virtually no competitive seats, or fewer than you had. And without those kind of purple districts, right, you don't have the swing voters to pass bipartisan legislation. We've seen that. What's the last significant piece of legislation that's been passed that changed something, right? It just hasn't happened. And because of that, you see constitutional rules get watered down. What used to require, 60 votes, now, you sneak ways in to just have 50 votes, et cetera, or you just ignore acts of Congress, which is happening all the time, right? I mean, acts of Congress created the Kennedy Center as the John F. Kennedy Memorial Kennedy Center. It's now, and more consequential things as well. So unless we figure out redistricting, we're going to a darker place politically, or at least at a minimum a dysfunctional place. And right now we're going hard in the opposite direction. I mean, you hear Democrats talk of having, national legislation to require nonpartisan commissions to decide redistricting, which has been tried in a bunch of states, but the states that tried that are now reversing it to try to make up for the numbers they've lost in other states, and League of Women Voters knows this far better than me. So it's, that trend line is really disturbing. And, that's a case of, hold your representatives accountable, right? It's best you and I can do individually.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. You kind of addressed this right now a little bit, but how can we speed up decision making in government? I mean, because as you said, the problems are piling up, they're coming faster and faster. I think you see in the EU, they produce a lot of rules and regulations, whether for better or for worse. I mean, here we have executive orders, you have the shadow docket for the Supreme Court, but maybe what can Congress do maybe to speed up and keep up with all these issues and try to produce rules and safeguards, for those problems?
There was a piece the other day talking about the difficulty to get building permits, right, which is part of the root of a housing shortage in this country, particularly affordable housing. I think it was in the Times, and that's something I hear from Democratic and Republican lawmakers, and you hear in both red and blue states, that you have to find a way to fast track that sort of thing, because we do have we've got a shortage of affordable stuff, and maybe you encounter that. I think Chuck was talking to me about that earlier. In the Pittsburgh area, you have an issue. We certainly have that in New York City, my hometown, DC area, increasingly. So there's an argument for that, and that might be one of those issues where you have some bipartisan agreement where you can pass some legislation to fast track that kind of stuff at the state or the federal level. The trouble is, so many of these issues, there are clear partisan divisions as to which way you want to go, so it's hard to see how you fast track it when you have such a divided, what you really have is you have a kind of winner takes all mentality, right? Because you get a small majority and then you flip everything one way, and then you might imagine that when the other party gets a small majority, they'll do the same thing. And then you have no continuity for those kinds of change. Look at AI policy, right? Even with the Trump administration, until a couple weeks ago, it wanted no regulation and was punishing states that tried to pass legislation or some regulation, and now has decided the national policy is actually, we got to figure out something out here. I'd like to hear a spirited and informed debate on Capitol Hill regarding AI policy, but maybe you have the same experience. Whenever I see technology discussed on Capitol Hill, I see a bunch of old people who don't know what they're talking about, right? We're talking about younger representatives, and it's really, and by the way, I'm one of those old people, right? So I'm not pointing the finger, I'm just saying I need smart people to figure out what our future looks like and how we're going to regulate it.
Question over here, Brian, on the white shirt.
Thank you for tonight. I'm thinking about income distribution, wealth concentration, and how that plays into the problems in democratic governance. Here in Pennsylvania, we have one of the lowest minimum wages. We're $7.25. We have an airport just outside of town that is probably in danger of going under, with Spirit going under. I'm in an industry that's being wiped out because of AI. And on the other hand, we have the concentration of billionaires. I've seen accounts of even benevolent ones like, Mackenzie Scott, who by some accounts was worth $36 billion at her divorce, has given away $20 billion and is worth $40 billion today. That kind of multiplication of money is just something we can't fathom, and billionaires have a lot more in common with billionaires in other parts of the world than they do with me or other people, I'm sure, sitting in this room. So where do you see the dangers of wealth concentration or that income disparity in the United States taking us?
Yeah, I think, that is a great question, because if there is a driver of democratic decline, is certainly this issue of inequality in general or wealth disparity. You don't see this, for example, in the northern countries. When you visit Finland, when you see Norway, when you go to Sweden, even the vision. Now, it doesn't mean that they don't have any issues or problems. Actually, they do. But the first thing is this disparity actually is not as visible as we actually sometimes see here in the States, right? And some of the data, I've read a data, for example, that the Bay Area of San Francisco, where now you have the majority of these kind of tech startups, concentrates 80% of the new wealth related to artificial intelligence, for example. That area, and it's 80%. And you're talking about billions or trillions of dollars, right? I think also this notion of, at least when you do some correlation, I'm not saying that it's causality, but correlation with, for example, our indicators and other democratic indicators with indicators of prosperity and economic and social equality, there is a correlation, at least by articulating both. Countries that are generally more prosper are generally more free countries, and they're generally more democratic countries. And the opposite is also holds in terms of correlation. And there's this sense also as well of working hard, basically, for what, right? I have a nice story actually of somebody who became president after being a young protester, and that is the former president of Chile. They were protesting against an increment of public transportation by 25 cents, which for young people and students, actually, that was a tremendous amount of income. Well, this guy who was the leader of this youth movement became the president. He was elected the president of Chile, the youngest elected president of Chile. And when he got into government, he actually tried to do 2 constitutional referendums. And both of them actually failed. And so this is somebody that actually I will recommend Betty to have someday as a guest, because his story as somebody who has risen from a social movement against wealth concentration and inequality is given the chance actually to govern one of the most democratic countries in the world, and comes up actually a little bit empty. And I think the reason is negotiations, of course, different political factions and all that, but certainly this is somebody that I'll recommend Betty to invite here to talk to you, because I think his story will talk a little bit about how you can make the argument, but at the same time, once you're in government, how complex and challenging it is to make those changes. Yeah.
One thing I'll just say from my personal experience is I've, in my work and travels, living overseas, I've worked and traveled in more than 100 countries, and it's always struck me that even the poorest countries, the ones going through the most difficult times, there are always wealthy people, right? You know, every country has its rich, powerful people, and they live behind walls, right? In countries rich and poor, they live separated. And you see that in different terms. I mean, I see it in Jordan. The rich people literally live on the tops of the hills outside of Amman, right? It's like, here are the poor, just like Rome, you know? The rich lived up on in the hills, and the poor lived down in the city and the valleys, and that still exists today. And I think you might see that if you went to Northern California, right? You know, and that separation is both physical, and it becomes more than just a physical separation, because it's separation and opportunity as well, and it becomes self-perpetuating. And I think that we're seeing a repeat of what we saw in the late 1900s, right? The age of, late 1800s, I should say, robber barons, concentration of wealth, which was a whole connection of phenomena, right? Because it wasn't just that you had, you know, the Rockefellers and the Gettys and so on with the super concentration of wealth, but you also had a super concentration of political power and monopolies or near monopolies, many of which we're seeing again today. And none of those are symptoms of a healthy system, right? Because it concentrates the benefits in a tiny 1% or less, and the folks down here get less, but also have less ability to move from top to bottom. And we have addressed that as a country before. I mean, we had a progressive movement that helped address some of those issues. I would argue, and again, I don't look at this as a political argument. I just think as an American, you know, it's a problem if the best universities are $100,000 a year, because it's not possible. The vast majority of the country can't afford that, therefore can't afford the path to the best next step. But it's always struck me wherever I've gone, there's always the wealthy, and they always live separate. And are we becoming more and more like that, you know, in our own country? The numbers seem to show that we are, right?
Thank you. I think we had Chuck right there. Yep.
We are a two-party country, but we have a lot more independent voters these days. Presents a bit of an issue here in Pennsylvania, because we're one of the few states that don't allow independent voters to vote in primaries. Do you ever see us getting away from a two-party system?
Good question. Is it possible?
Yeah. In that sense, again, I think the U.S. is also an anomaly, actually. We're talking also over lunch. There are 4 other systems that are similar to the U.S. in the world, and it's because they wanted to follow the U.S. They are federal, presidential, constitutional republics, right? And only one of them still has the two-party system. Everybody else actually in these countries have adopted a much more multifaceted part. Certainly, a much more parliamentarian federation like Germany and other countries allow for more representation, and even that goes up the different layers of government, meaning your county, your local level, your middle, and also your national level. I think, you know, that maybe is something that can be rethought, right, a little bit, because that system worked very well for a number of years. And again, I go back to my earlier comment about the political community. It served well a much more homogeneous political community, which I think no longer exists probably across the country. Now, what would it take to do that is really a question that is much more of political will, right? And there have been some intents actually to have more independent candidates, which in my own opinion, I think it really brings much more rich debate and choice for the voter. There is something that is being used, I think, in some counties or even state levels, which is the rank voting, in which, as opposed to primaries, you have candidates that pretty much don't necessarily belong to the two political parties. And it's a way basically to, at the end, come up with maybe the 2 or 3 that actually have the most votes. So far, I think the analysis on how effective they could be at the national level is still up for grabs. At the local level in my work, particularly in places where you are, you know, want to make sure that there is more, you know, pluralistic representation. But that is really, to me, an interesting question that remains unanswered. And the question I have is, if we move to a multi-party system, who would take that first step towards it?
I mean, it would require the parties to give up power. That's the problem, right? They'd have to. Now, you do see, and again, I'm not a political analyst, I'm just describing what I sort of see and talk about on the air, but you do see voters defy the party, right, on candidates. I mean, the Republican Party is an example, right, because Donald Trump was not the choice of the Republican Party in 2016. Voters propelled him to be the Republican nominee. You're seeing this happen now in this Democratic Senate race in New England, right, where the party definitely wanted one candidate, and voters were like, nope, not interested. And it's not the same as multi-party, right, but it is folks saying, I'm not going to listen to the party grandees, I'm going to choose my own person. But I would be surprised to see either one of these parties vote for something that you know, changes that in some sort of institutional way. It would have to be driven. It would have to be, you know, the independent candidates have won, they just lose, right? It's just hard, it's hard to win as an independent candidate at the national level.
We're going to have to leave it there for tonight. I know there is so much more, and this is just the beginning of this conversation in Pittsburgh with our Civic Futures series. Thank you so much, Jim. Thank you so much, Gerardo, for helping us get it started tonight.
Yes.
Thank you to our partners at Public Source. Please check them out if you don't already follow the important work that they're doing. Please join the League of Women Voters if you're not already a member in Greater Pittsburgh and the surrounding area. Thank you to Stay Gold Books, who's in the lobby. Pick up a copy of Jim's book. He's going to stick around and sign. And thank you all for coming out and getting engaged, and please stay engaged, and let's continue this conversation and this work. Our next Civic Futures program is this Saturday. We're hopping on our bikes and talking a bit more about democracy with our friends at Public Source again. And next week we'll have a program on the economic impact of immigration policy today, and the conversation continues year-round, so please join us. We also want to close thanking the Heinz Endowments for their support for Civic Futures. Thank you all so much. Have a great night. Be well.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.